Hello, a very good evening. Flights are resuming at Heathrow Airport after a fire in an electric substation closed one of the world's busiest travel hubs. Counter-terrorism police are among several agencies investigating the fire, which broke out in the early hours of this morning, causing power outages to nearby residents. Thousands of passengers have been stranded around the globe as planes were diverted, turned around or grounded. The government says questions need to be answered. We'll look into all those issues shortly, but first let's go to Matthew Thompson, who's at Heathrow Airport for us. And Matt, we are expecting flights to take off and land this evening.
Yes, indeed, any second now, in fact. The sleeping giant awakes, shall we say. I mean, Heathrow Airport, Europe's busiest, an average usually of just under 60 flights an hour, has just had its first flight in nearly 16 hours land shortly after 6 o'clock. It was a British Airways flight all the way from, well, Gatwick. And that actually tells its own interesting story. I mean, such is the scale of the disruption that many airplanes simply aren't where they're supposed to be. And it's such a logistical challenge to kind of reshuffle them, not just across the UK, but right across the world, that it's likely that this disruption is going to last well beyond just today. And then we were told that a handful of flights, just 8 were announced so far, would be taking off shortly after 7 o'clock. So really any minute now, the first set to leave. There are 2 to Cape Town, 2 to Johannesburg, 2 to Singapore, 1 to Riyadh and 1 to Buenos Aires as well. And I've just spent 20 minutes or so at Terminal 5 speaking to passengers arriving, many of them positively giddy with joy that plans that looked on the verge of being dashed are now given a last-minute reprieve. I spoke to one man who gave his name as Charlie, seemed to be on a lad's golfing trip, and he said simply, "There is a God." I spoke to another couple who had just checked into an airport hotel, expecting to spend at least the night there, when they got a text saying that their flight to Singapore was going ahead. But look, these very few happy stories are very much the exception. They will be vastly outweighed, shall we say, by the scores, dozens, hundreds of plans that have been dashed over the last 24 hours or so. And as I say, such is the scale of that disruption that I think it's likely that many, many more plans may be dashed before the problems here are resolved.
Yeah, we're hearing, Matthew, that the airport obviously will be operational again tomorrow, but the chaos could last for some time because, of course, planes, crews, passengers stranded all over the world, and it's not as simple as just clicking your fingers.
No, absolutely. I mean, such is the sort of intricacy, if you like, with which these webs of air traffic are so finely balanced that, you know, putting 1 or 2 of those chess pieces out of place is a problem. Putting hundreds, thousands of them out of place, well, you can imagine the logistical problems that will cause. And so most experts who know about these things are telling us that it's going to take 3-4 days at least to really fix the problems, to have all those chess pieces rearranged as they should be. And so that means that even if the most acute problems are fixed and electricity is restored and flights are restored to Heathrow, they are confident, they say, that the airport will be functioning tomorrow. Those knock-on effects of Europe's busiest airport effectively being out of action for, 16, 17 hours plus, well, those are going to be felt for many days yet to come.
Yeah, and overnight restrictions have been lifted as well to try and help get those chess pieces, as you say, back into their right place. Matthew, thank you very much. Well, this flight, we are told, is from Manchester Airport, making its final approach live for you into Heathrow. We were told flights would resume this evening as Heathrow's chief executive apologised to stranded passengers and defended the response to what he called an unprecedented loss of power caused by that substation fire. Thomas Walby describing the blaze which knocked out that electricity substation in Hayes, saying it was as big as it gets for our airport and that we cannot guard ourselves 100%. He also said that a backup transformer failed, meaning systems had to be closed down in accordance with safety procedures so that power supplies could be restructured from 2 remaining substations to restore electricity enough to power what is described as a mid-sized city. Anyone who is familiar with this part of London will know that it is a very normal sight, seeing the bright lights of aircraft stacked up in a queue coming into Heathrow on their final approach. Sometimes you can see 4, maybe even 5 aircraft, all just a minute or so behind each other, making that journey. It's very normal, but tonight it is anything but normal. This, one of the first aircraft to land at Heathrow after the airport was closed in the early hours of this morning. This, a flight not come far, only from Manchester. But of course, like Matthew was saying, all the airlines now having to get their planes in the right place so that as many scheduled flights can take off as possible tomorrow. Matthew Thompson still on the line. Quite a moment this, Matthew, this plane coming in to land. It's always very surreal, isn't it, when the airport is closed? I remember during the pandemic actually cycling around Heathrow. So unusual was it to not hear the roar of aircraft taking off and landing.
I think you're right. That's the one thing you do notice. You know, anytime you spend any time around Heathrow, it is such a noisy place. You know, there are flights taking off really every minute. I mean, I think at peak times, you can even have landings every 45 seconds or so, as people who live under those flight paths will no doubt tell you. But even when I was in, Terminal 5 a short time ago, speaking to passengers who were arriving, even then, sort of strange, emptiness around the place. All the cafes that are usually bustling were all empty. The hordes of people that you usually see queuing, people sleeping on benches, all of those hallmarks of major international airports, none of those in place at all. Instead, just rows and rows of empty check-in desks, rows and rows of planes just sitting on the stands. And that's part of the problem. Many of those planes aren't supposed to be here. And many of the planes that aren't here have got to get here, and that's really the huge logistical challenge. So even as we see Heathrow start to open up now, the first flight, as I say, landing all the way from sunny Gatwick just after 6, the first flight's taking off very soon as well. That's going to take a long time to sort through. And so even if, it starts to get back up into gear again over the next few hours, the peak flight numbers, 1,400 a day, perhaps, at its absolute peak. First of all, it's got to accelerate to those levels, and then you've got to redress all that backlog and, as I mentioned a moment ago, rearrange all those chess pieces so that flights can get where they're supposed to be. I can't even imagine what an extraordinary logistical challenge that is, but clearly that's going to take some time.
Just looking at another aircraft, Matthew, as you're talking, coming in on its final approach. I mean, full marks to our camera operator. Any hardened plane spotter will know just how difficult it is to find a spot near Heathrow Airport to get those pictures of aircraft coming in. And, of course, even when it lands, it's usually behind a terminal building. But this another aircraft making that final approach. The airport did initially announce it would be closed until 1 minute to midnight tonight, but it later said that repatriation flights for passengers diverted to other airports in Europe would resume this evening. This may well be one of those repatriation flights. Just looking at the tailfin, I think you can just about work out that it is a British Airways aircraft. Several airlines, of course, announcing they would restart scheduled flights both to and from Heathrow, including British Airways, Air Canada, United Airlines as well. And restrictions on overnight flights also temporarily lifted to help ease congestion. That's according to the Department of Transport. And a number of long-haul flights will be taking off this evening. Not delayed flights from earlier in the day, but scheduled flights, scheduled long-haul flights will take off later on this evening. But as we can see, flights beginning to land at Europe's busiest airport.